listening to the podcast series Introducing the Tanak with Brooke Lester. Thank you for downloading. This episode is Introduction to the Tanak, Part A, the Tanak and the Christian Canon. If we're going to talk about the literature of ancient Israel, we're going to need to agree on a common vocabulary for doing so. Traditionally, the Christian churches have referred to this material as the Old Testament, setting it, of course, against the Christian scriptures of the New Testament. A perceived problem in this has been that by referring to something as old, especially set against something else that's new, the word old tends to have the sense of obsolescence. The idea is that whatever is new has replaced the thing that is old, like a new version of software replaces an old version, or a new edition of a book replaces the old edition. Theologically, this has presented a problem, although it's not uncommon for Christian lay people and clergy to make comments like, why do we need to study this Old Testament when we have the New Testament? Why do we have to read this material when we have Jesus? It's a common kind of a claim, and yet, historically, the Christian churches have affirmed again and again that the Old Testament is not replaced by the New Testament, and that the Old Testament continues to have a valid and essential place as part of the canon of the whole Christian literature, the whole Bible. In response to this, folks have looked for other ways of talking about the material instead of the Old Testament. And perhaps the most common, and you may have heard this, is to talk about the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew Bible, because for the most part the material is composed in Hebrew. This is so common that lots of folks would consider the problems to be solved with this moniker, and it is indeed widely used. You'll see courses now in Introduction to the Hebrew Bible instead of Introduction to the Old Testament, for example. However, people will point out a couple of problems. One being that the material is not all written in Hebrew. The parts of the so-called Hebrew Bible are in fact composed in Aramaic. So, for example, about half of the book of Daniel is in Aramaic, and a good chunk of Ezra Nehemiah, and then little words and bits here and there elsewhere. So we would really want to call it the Hebrew Aramaic Bible. Further, that's only if one is a Protestant. If one is Roman Catholic, then there are additional materials that are part of your Old Testament or Hebrew Aramaic canon that were composed in Greek. This includes additions to the book of Daniel and books like First Maccabees and Second Maccabees and others. So at that point, we would, strictly speaking, want to call it the Hebrew Aramaic Greek Bible. Which is even more confusing when you've got the whole Greek New Testament that you're trying to set it against. This is true not only for the Roman Catholic canon, but also for the Eastern Orthodox canon, which has even more of these Greek so-called additions that are part of the canon. Another problem, beyond that kind of nitpicking about the moniker Hebrew Bible, is simply that by calling it the Hebrew Bible, well, for one thing, we might call it the Hebrew or Hebrew Aramaic or Hebrew Aramaic and Greek Bible, but nevertheless, for the most part, we don't read it in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. We read it in English. For the vast majority of those who are reading the material, Christians who are reading it in English. So their perception of it is that it is an English Bible, just like their New Testament is an English Bible. Furthermore, calling it the Hebrew Bible, at least in my experience, it seems to me that tends to be interpreted as, when we say Hebrew Bible, it sort of sounds like the Jewish Bible. That is, in our world, it's Israelis the Jews are the only ones who, if anybody, are speaking Hebrew and reading the Bible in Hebrew for the most part, except for scholars of all stripes. And Christians, when we use the term Hebrew Bible, it tends to sound like Jewish Bible, which brings us right back to that problem of considering the material to be made obsolete for any who are not Jews. So Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, also the way that in fact many Jews will refer to the material, and this has gained a lot of acceptance among Christian readers of the Bible as well, is to call this material the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K. And Tanakh is an acronym of sorts, T-N-K. And these each stand for a part of the literature of ancient Israel. And these are first the Torah, which means instruction or law. And that's the first 5 books, or the books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy constitute the Torah, the instruction or the law. And the second part of the material is the N for Nevi'im, and that's simply Hebrew for prophets, the prophets. And that would, and then the third section is K for Ketuvim, and that stands for the writings. So putting together the Torah as the first part of the Hebrew scriptures, the Nevi'im, or prophets, as the second part, and the Ketuvim, the writings, as the third part. You put that all together and you get Tanakh. Now, it is only traditionally Jews who read the material in that order. That is, it's a Bible written in Hebrew or translated from the Hebrew for a Jewish audience is going to put the material in that order. The Torah followed by the Nevi'im, the prophets followed by the Ketuvim, or the writings. For Christian Protestants, the books of their Old Testament are the same as the Tanakh, but they're not in the same order. That is, especially a part of the prophets, and I'm thinking of people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, Habakkuk, and all those folks. They're moved to the end. They're not in the middle, but they're moved to the end after the writings for historical reasons that I think are not entirely clear, but which have the effect of putting the prophets at the end of the canon, and for Christians who see the prophets as basically pointing towards Christ or anticipating Christ, they serve that function very well by being placed at the end of the canon of the literature of ancient Israel. For Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, those prophets also sit at the end, along with some additional what for the prophets would be, what for the Protestants would be additional material. Looking closer at this Tanakh and its divisions, we can see that a part of what's happened here is the division of Torah followed by Nevi'im, that is prophets, followed by Ketuvim, that is writings, is for historical reasons. That is, there's good historical evidence that the Torah, the law, was the first body of the literature of ancient Israel to be considered authoritative as a group for groups in Judaism. The reason we think this is because these were the first books to be translated into Greek. When large parts of the Jewish worshiping communities had stopped being fluent in Hebrew, but were instead communicating in Aramaic and in Greek, the rabbis began to translate the literature of ancient Israel into Greek so that their hearers could understand it. And the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, was the first body of literature to be so translated. And so it came to be considered as one large group, the Torah. It was only later that the prophets began to be translated into Greek, and so that became a second layer, a second section of what became authoritative literature for the Judaisms of the day. And then finally, it was only after that that the material we call the writings also began to achieve something of a uniform canonical or authoritative status and to be translated into Greek as well. So the division of law and prophets and writings doesn't simply have to do with what the content is, with what kind of material are in those books, but also just simply by when they became authoritative for Judaisms of the time. This accounts for the reason why, for instance, in the writings, which for the most part consists of books like Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes, wisdom literature and the Psalms and things like that, but then you also get the books of Chronicles in there, which are very historical and seem to belong in another part of the canon, but they apparently became authoritative chronicles at a relatively late date, and so were lumped in with the writings. Unfolding this division just a little bit further, the law and the prophets and the writing, that middle group, the prophets, can be unfolded into two groups, the former prophets and the latter prophets. When you think of the former prophets, think of what you probably would think of as the historical books, and these are Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. These are the books that tell the story of the entry of the people Israel into the Promised Land, the period of the charismatic leadership of the judges, and then the period of the monarchy all the way through to the end of the monarchical period in the history of the people Israel. So this is what the readers of the English translation Bibles will think of as the historical books. It's the story of the people Israel in the Promised Land. Why did the Judaisms of the time refer to these, come to refer to these traditionally as the former prophets? For a number of reasons. One is that they gradually became convinced that these were authored by prophets. For instance, it was thought that Samuel was the author of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, for example. Also, there's a good deal about prophets in these books. You get the history of David, and David's counterpart is Nathan. And then there are other prophets like Elisha and Elijah who play a very great role during the time depicted in these historical books. So the former prophets. And then there's the group of books that are called the latter prophets. And these are the prophets that you think of as prophets. These are folks like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, not Daniel, interestingly, although in our English Bibles, our Christian Bibles, Daniel is placed among the prophets. In the Tanak, he will actually be placed among the writings. But then you also have folks like Hosea, Amos, Habakkuk, Nahum, and all of these folks who are also among the prophets. So we can divide the prophets between the former prophets and the latter prophets. And furthermore, these latter prophets, that is the named prophets, can be divided into two groups. And these are sometimes called the major prophets and the minor prophets. Major prophets are folks like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And these are called the major prophets, not because they're considered to be more important or more authoritative than the so-called minor prophets, but simply because their books are bigger. Isaiah is a great big book of 66 chapters. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are also good long books. And each of them takes up a whole scroll. And so they have a scroll to themselves, and that's what makes them a major prophet. And then you've got the so-called minor prophets, 12 of them in there: Amos, Hosea, Habakkuk, Nahum. Interestingly, even Jonah, who is kind of a, if you'll excuse the pun, another kettle of fish altogether. The minor prophets. Why are they the minor prophets? Again, not because they're less important or less authoritative than the major prophets, but they're so small. You can take all 12 of the so-called minor prophets and fit them onto a single scroll, the scroll of the 12, and that's why they are thought of as the minor prophets. So in terms of our divisions, there are three basic divisions in the Tanakh: the Torah, or law, the Nevi'im, or prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. The Nevi'im can be divided into two big groups: the prophets, the former prophets, and the latter prophets. Typically, when I teach a course in the literature of ancient Israel, my course is divided into four chunks, because we have the Torah, that is the law, the former prophets, the latter prophets, and then the writings. So it's a major division there in the prophets between the former prophets, or historical books, and the latter prophets, that is, books that are named for prophets, like Isaiah and company. And then even among the latter prophets, there's a division that can be made between the major, or big book prophets, and the minor, or little bitty book prophets. To Christian readers who are coming to the Tanakh in an organized way for the first time, something I wish to try to impress upon them is that is to think of the Old Testament and the New Testament and again, on terminology, what is the right terminology out of what we've talked about: the Old Testament, the Hebrew or Hebrew Aramaic or Hebrew Aramaic Greek Bible, or the Tanakh? I don't mind saying that for me it's largely a matter of indifference, as long as we're aware of what sort of effect our vocabulary may have on our hearer. You'll hear me slip fairly fluidly between these different labels, depending on what I'm trying to communicate. And I certainly invite and welcome my students to do the same. Anyway, in looking at the so-called Old Testament and New Testament as one body of scripture for Christians, something I wish to try to encourage my students to see is to think of to see the New Testament as concerning God's dealings with and through Jesus, and the Old Testament as being basically about God's dealings with and through the people Israel. In the Old Testament, God is dealing with the people Israel, dealing with them to accomplish certain things, and working through them to accomplish certain things. And then in the New Testament, God is working with Jesus to accomplish certain things, and working through Jesus to accomplish certain things. So there's a kind of parallelism there, a kind of a parallelism of theme. As readers of the New Testament, an idea that can be hard for us to wrap our mind around is that the New Testament, the story of God's dealings with and through Jesus, is really only sensible as a continuation of God's dealings with and through the people Israel. This has been a conviction of the church, is every time they decide not to cut the Old Testament out of our canon, is because if we are going to understand the way the New Testament describes God's ways with and through Jesus, then we have to understand God's ways with and through the people Israel as described in the Old Testament. So to look at some precise examples, think of these New Testament realities like prophecy, kingship, priesthood, Messiah, justice. All of these words, if we think we know what they mean, the New Testament is assuming that we know these words from the Old Testament. All of these terms, when the New Testament uses terms like prophecy, it's using the word prophecy, it's adopting it out of an Old Testament matrix that had a cohesive historical sense and context before being appropriated into New Testament texts and concerns. That is, the New Testament use of words like prophecy and kingship or priesthood or justice, its understandings of these depend on the Old Testament use and context of such terms, because the New Testament writers who were using these phrases were already soaked, immersed, raised in the literary world of the Old Testament. A part of what this means is that as 21st century Christians, our perspective on the Old Testament material is in some ways almost the opposite of that of the writers of the New Testament, the early Jewish worshippers of Jesus. For us, the Jesus story, the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, is something that is already familiar. Even if we weren't raised in a church, simply by being raised in a Western culture dominated world, if we are, we have soaked up the Jesus story through our pores. And to an extent that the basic narrative of the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus is to us an almost kind of self-evident kind of narrative. It feels comfortable and familiar. Whereas the Old Testament is something that we probably don't know very well. It's not used much in our lectionaries, and even there we sort of get the same short texts over and over and over again, rather than the breadth of the Old Testament. For the early worshippers of Jesus, however, the situation was precisely the reverse. Whatever had happened in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus was a strange and shocking and strange new thing that had to be parsed out and understood. And the way this was done was by going back to a body of literature that was familiar and comfortable and well understood. That is what for us is the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And that's what I mean when I say our situation is very much reversed. For us, the claims of the New Testament seem self-evident, but the Old Testament is hard to understand. For the disciples and for the writers of the New Testament, however, the situation was something like the reverse. The Old Testament was the sensible thing that made sense of the weirdness that was Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. A former student of mine put it, I think, very well. She said that the early church did not read Scripture, that is the Old Testament, Christologically. Rather, they read Jesus scripturally. Think about that again. The early worshippers of Jesus and the writers of the New Testament did not read their Hebrew Bible through a Christ lens, through a Christological lens. Rather, they looked at the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus in their attempt to understand that through the lens of the Hebrew Bible, which is a very different thing. The question then becomes, how can we, as Gentile Christian latecomers to the gospel, how can we seek to reproduce in ourselves the sort of experience of the Old Testament that the New Testament writers and the followers of Jesus took for granted? That is, how can we sort of bracket our Jesus lens while trying to look at the material through fresh eyes? One very successful way of accomplishing this has been to attend to the historical context in which the material was written. That is, to look at who do we think wrote the material, in what social setting did they write it, and in response to what? What was going on around them, and what were they trying to accomplish in their hearers in the composing of this material? To think of a modern example, think of someone like Martin Luther King in the I Have a Dream speech. In some ways, we can imagine a situation maybe 1,000 years from now where hearers of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech might have forgotten all about the details of American history and the context in which Dr. King uttered his words. And we can imagine a student sitting in a classroom and being honestly unsure whether Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech in the 1950s or perhaps the 1850s or even the 1650s. And some of them might wonder whether it really matters. After all, don't Dr. King's words have some sort of enduring or timeless value that just sort of relativizes the context in which they were written? Yet at the same time, those of us who know our American history, who are close to Dr. King in time, might think that it makes something of a difference whether Dr. King uttered his words in the 1950s in the context of civil rights, Jim Crow laws, fire hoses, Rosa Parks, police dogs, or if he had uttered his words in the 1850s, during the period when there was still slavery in the United States before the Civil War, or if we thought he uttered his words in the 1650s, when the abolition of slavery was just not even yet on anybody's mind, and where slavery was just beginning in what would become the United States. We might think that it makes something of a difference. Maybe not all the difference, because there are ways in which Dr. King's words are sort of timeless and out of their historical context in that way. But we might think that the details matter. In the same way, we might find ourselves coming to believe that the more we get to know the context in which, say, the book of Isaiah was written, it might make a difference to us once we get to know this history, whether particular words, phrases, chapters, sections of Isaiah were written in the 8th century BCE or in the 6th century BCE or even in the 5th century BCE. Once we get to know what's going on in each of these time periods, we may begin to think that it makes something of a difference to our reading. Perhaps not all the difference, because we find that there are ways in which Isaiah's words transcend their historical context and speak to people, to all people. But at the same time, we might find that some of that it's illuminating at points to see that context. One concern that readers of the Bible might have is when we start paying attention to the historical context of this material, when we start to say, what did Isaiah say? What was Isaiah saying to his own hearers in his own context? What was Isaiah trying to communicate in the 8th century to his 8th century listeners? There may be a concern that there's an either-or thing happening here, that if Isaiah is speaking to his own audience, to his own hearers, we might be afraid that that means that we're proposing that Isaiah does not speak to us in the 21st century. That if his words had a particular meaning in their own context, that maybe we're saying they don't have meaning in the 21st century. That's a continuing concern, and yet over and over we find that that what the church experiences is a both and then we find this even in the Hebrew Bible, as we'll see as we get into our continuing reading of the Bible, that over and over again groups will look at things like the book of Isaiah or parts of the book Isaiah and say, okay, regardless of what its meaning was in the past for other groups, it is saying something specifically to us right now. And then years will pass and communities will come and go, and then another community in its own context will read the words of Isaiah and find that they have particular meanings in their own context and speaks to them. And this happens over and over, as it happens for us in the 21st century when we also read Isaiah. For cultural reasons, especially in the United States, this question of an either-or comes up again and again. There's often this sense that any text, and perhaps especially a biblical text, can only have one real meaning. What does the Bible really mean? What does Isaiah really mean? And so if we find that Isaiah is speaking to us, there's a sense that Isaiah is speaking only to us. This is, I would argue, there's a theological problem there, at least, in the sense that if that's what we think, then we're arguing that all of those preceding generations of both Christians and Jews who found that God spoke to them in their time through the words of Isaiah, that they must have been mistaken or misled or foolish in some way, benighted and unknowing of what its true meaning was going to be for us in the 21st century. I think many of us would agree that there's something of a problem there. And so we begin to be motivated to imagine these biblical texts, and perhaps even non-biblical texts, as having multiple meanings, as being able to sustain a range of readings that speak to different groups of different people in their own historical contexts. This is the end of part A of this podcast episode, Introducing the Tanakh. If you would, please open part B of Introducing the Tanakh and continue. Thank you.